One of the things that courtrooms are intended to do is to get beyond speculation, to get beyond rumor, and to get down to fact. And that's what I wanted to do when I was investigating the case for Christ, especially when it came to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Because there have been some rumors that have started about whether or not Jesus really did die on the cross. For instance, in the early 19th century, some writers speculated that, well, Jesus didn't really die on the cross. What happened was he fainted or he swooned. And people thought that he was dead, but he wasn't really. And so they took him down from the cross and they put him in the tomb, and the cool, damp air from the tomb resuscitated him. And so there is no miraculous resurrection because he was never really dead. You just have a fortuitous resuscitation. And then this has been picked up by writers through the years. In fact, as recently as 1992, an Australian writer said that this is actually what took place. Now, there's no reputable scholar in the world who believes that that's really the truth. But I needed to establish, as if in a court of law, what the facts were concerning the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, to rule out the possibility that he came down from the cross alive. So I flew to California, and I tracked down Dr. Alexander Metherell. Dr. Metherell is recognized as one of the leading experts in the world on the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. He's a medical doctor. He also has a second doctorate in the area of engineering. And he's written extensively on this particular issue. And so I interviewed him, and the first thing I said to him was, as we approach the crucifixion in the writings in the New Testament, we see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the New Testament writers say that he was sweating blood because he was in such anguish. And I said, now, that can't be true. Who's ever heard of anybody sweating blood? Doesn't that just show that the writers of the New Testament didn't know what they were talking about? But Dr. Metherell said, no, it shows that you don't quite understand medical knowledge, he said. Because there is a condition called hematidrosis. What happens in hematidrosis is when a person is under tremendous stress and tremendous anguish, chemicals are released by the body, and they can break down the capillaries in your sweat glands. And a little bit of blood is released into your sweat so that it appears that you are sweating blood. There is literally blood in your sweat that comes out. And so this is probably, he said, exactly what happened to Jesus. He was experiencing this particular medical condition. And he said one of the things that it also does is it sets your skin up to be extremely fragile and sensitive, which would have made what happened to him next particularly gruesome. Now, the Bible barely mentions the fact that Jesus was flogged before he was crucified. But we know from accounts in ancient history that Roman floggings were tremendously brutal, that they used a whip of braided leather and they had balls of lead woven into it to cause deep contusions. They had pieces of sheep bone and fish bone woven into the whip so that it would then cut your back. And often the backs of these people who were flogged were so shredded that their very spine was exposed. We know that the beating of Jesus Christ was particularly brutal because, according to Dr. Metherell, there's good indication that he was suffering from hypovolemic shock at the end of the beating. We know that because he couldn't carry his cross all the way to the place of execution, and the fact that he was so thirsty on the cross. What is hypovolemic shock? Hypo refers to low. Volemic refers to, or the vol part refers to volume, and emic refers to blood. So it's talking about the effects of a low volume of blood. In other words, Jesus lost so much blood during the beating that took place that he was in a very weakened state, that he was very close to death before the crucifixion even began. We know then that according to how crucifixion took place, Jesus had the crossbar, the vertical stake was permanent into the ground. He had the horizontal bar in which he was laid down, and then nails were driven through his wrists. I know that a lot of the paintings show it through his palm of his hand, but it's actually through the wrist where it was driven. In fact, it was driven right through an area where the median nerve runs. And I asked Dr. Metherow, why is that significant? And he said, because the median nerve is the largest nerve that runs out to the hand. He said to me, Lee, have you ever hit your funny bone? And I said, yeah, I have. He said, it hurts, doesn't it? And I said, yeah, it does. And he said, that's another nerve. And he said, to drive a spike through the wrist means that you are crushing the median nerve. And he said the pain of that would be the equivalent of taking a pair of pliers and of squeezing your funny bone. And you could just imagine the pain of that. In fact, crucifixion was such a painful and gruesome execution that they had to invent a whole new word to describe the pain of crucifixion. That's where the word excruciating comes from. It means out of the cross. They had to come up with a new word to explain the extreme pain that was experienced by those people who were crucified. Then, after Jesus was hoisted onto the vertical post and nails were driven through his feet, crucifixion is fundamentally a slow and painful death by asphyxiation. I want to read to you the testimony in My Case for Christ, in my book by that title, that Dr. Metherow provided as he describes what happens to a person who is being crucified. He said the reason this is asphyxiation is that the stresses on the muscles and the diaphragm put the chest into an inhaled position. Basically, he said, in order to exhale, the individual must push up on his feet so the tension on the muscles would be eased for a moment. In doing so, the nail would tear through his foot, eventually locking up against the tarsal bones. After managing to exhale, the person would then be able to relax down and take another breath in. Again, he'd have to push himself up to exhale, scraping his bloodied back against the coarse wood of the cross. This would go on and on and on, up and down, until complete exhaustion would take place, and a person would not be able to push up and to breathe anymore. And then the person would begin to go into what is called respiratory acidosis, and this would cause an irregular heartbeat, and then finally cardiac arrest, or a heart attack in effect. But something else was taking place too, as Jesus was undergoing the crucifixion. And that is that because of the hypovolemic shock, there was fluid that would collect around the heart and fluid that would collect around his lung. The reason this is important is that in order to make sure that Jesus was dead, a Roman soldier took a spear and shoved it between Jesus' ribs, apparently on the right side. It apparently punctured his lung and punctured his heart. We know that John described what happened in his writings and described how what he said, water and blood came out. What that was the water that had collected around Jesus' heart and around his lungs came out, followed by a large volume of blood. This showed that even though John probably didn't understand what he was writing about, he was accurately describing the crucifixion, because that's what you would see in that particular situation. Now, there was some controversy. I pointed out to Dr. Metherow. I said the Harvard Theological Review a number of years ago said that there's really doubt that nails were used in the feet of crucifixion victims. And I said, so doesn't that mean that when the Bible says nails were used, that they're wrong? And well, as it turns out, in 1968, they were able to excavate the bodies of a few crucifixion victims from just about the time of Jesus. One of them still had a 7-inch spike in his foot and still bits of the wooden cross attached to it. And so that established that the use of nails in crucifixion as opposed to ropes was used in the first century. And this is one more bit of evidence that the writers of the biographies of Jesus were accurate in what it is that they describe. So I asked Dr. Metherow the final question. I said, Dr. Metherow, based on your experience, is there any possible way Jesus could have come down from the cross alive? And Dr. Metherow said, in his expert medical opinion, there is absolutely no way that could have happened. And then I said, well, you know, let's say the impossible happened. Let's say he somehow managed to get down off the cross. What kind of a medical condition would he be in at that time? And Dr. Metherell said, well, first of all, his back would have been totally shredded. He would have had nails through his feet and through his hand. There's no way he could have walked down the road to Emmaus, as the Bible said he did. He would have been in such desperately awful medical condition that there is no way his supposed resurrection then would have created a movement of people who were so excited to someday have a resurrection body just like Jesus. If Jesus had survived the cross, he would have been in such horrible medical conditions that his disciples would have had such pity on him. They would have tried to get him medical help. They wouldn't have proclaimed the joyous news that he'd been resurrected from the dead. There's no way a movement based upon the ultimate hope of having a resurrection body someday like Jesus could have ever started among the disciples if Jesus had been in that kind of a brutally beaten and such a desperate medical condition as he would have been in if he had survived the cross and merely been resuscitated as opposed to resurrected. Well, then I put to Dr. Metherell maybe the biggest question, maybe the most important question. And that was the why question. Why did Jesus Christ allow himself to go through this brutal beating at the hands of the Roman torturers, this hanging from a cross, this horrible, slow, painful death by asphyxiation, this spear thrust into his side, this public humiliation and degradation that crucifixion represented? I asked him, why in the world would he allow himself to go through that? And Dr. Metherell thought for a moment, and he looked at me and he said, I can think of no other reason other than love. What would motivate Jesus to go through that? His love for you, his love for me. That he was willing to endure the degradation and the pain of this horrible death to pay for our sin, that we might be set free. And I walked away from that interview with Alexander Metherell marveling at the love of God, that he would allow himself to go through that for someone like me who spent my entire life denying and denouncing that very God. We're going to talk next time about the ultimate evidence for the deity of Jesus Christ, and that is the evidence for his resurrection from the dead. That is the ultimate establishment, the ultimate authentication that he was telling the truth when he said he is the one and the only Son of God.